where the progressives really failed in the eyes of historians is in terms of race relations. During the progressives era, we will see the beginning of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow specifically refers to segregation, but for our purposes, we are going to think of it in terms of three things: disfranchisement, taking the right to vote away, segregation, and lynchings, state-sponsored violence, essentially. So we will be looking at all those three things. Now, there is a mistake that is frequently made, even among historians, and a lot of textbooks do this, where they present Jim Crow as happening right after Reconstruction. And that is not accurate. There were a couple decades before Jim Crow really got solidly codified in the United States, especially at the federal level. So there, right after the Civil War, right after Reconstruction, there were a couple decades where African Americans actually had more rights. But then those would all go away. And the reason this is part of the progressive era is because, for one, it was 1880s, or 1890s especially is when it was passed, when these things got really ingrained in society, and when they're really codified by the federal government. But also, everything about Jim Crow is compatible with progressivism. One, they were absolutely okay with taking away individual rights for the greater good. Two, it was based on science and experts of the time and scientific racism. And three, all of this has to be done by governments, local governments, state governments, and even the federal government. So this is all part of progressivism. And again, there's this gap between Reconstruction and Jim Crow, partly because African American had a lot of protections in place. They had the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal citizenship. They have the 15th Amendment, guaranteed the right to vote. And in 1875, Congress actually passes a Civil Rights Act, which says that essentially you cannot segregate individuals based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So it essentially codifies the idea that African Americans are allowed to go anywhere in society that whites go. So what happened? And this is a huge oversimplification, but this is a survey level history class. So there were a couple major things that will lead to the rise of Jim Crow. One was the populist movement, or the Farmers' Revolt. If you remember, before the Civil War, if you were a poor white, no matter how poor you are, if you were white in the South, you had something going for you, which is that you were a free man. Following Reconstruction, following the Civil War and Reconstruction, when poor blacks and poor whites, they ended up being essentially socioeconomically the same. They were the same social status because there were not specific laws just targeting blacks. So now blacks and whites are essentially the same place. And when they were in the same place, they were willing to work together. That's why the populist movement was or the Farmers' Revolt movement in general, was so unusual in U.S. history, because poor blacks and poor whites, farmers, were willing to work together. But it also got to the point where, the political parties actually were trying to compete for black votes. And that just didn't sit well with poor whites or rich whites. So, and this is true like in Texas in 1892, all the parties are trying to compete for the African American vote. And whether you were wealthy or poor, whites just didn't like that. So upper class and lower class whites effectively will agree, all right, let's just keep our fighting between whites. So they didn't have to try to appeal to black voters. And this is a big reason for the rise of disenfranchisement, or taking away blacks' ability to vote, because again, it did not sit well that they were trying to compete with each other for African American vote. So laws will be passed all throughout the South, and it happens gradually. It doesn't happen everywhere at once, but essentially taking away blacks' right to vote. And there were all sorts of different ways they did it. There were literacy tests where they give anyone who wanted to vote, they have to take a test where they have to answer a bunch of questions like interpreting the Constitution. And they did this in front of a judge. And it was so insane that this was tested. An African American that had like a Harvard degree couldn't pass, but a poor white that had never attended college would pass. So literacy tests were one way. Property requirements were a pretty good way, because obviously freed slaves didn't have property. But what became the most popular way to disfranchise were poll taxes. And this is a tax in order to vote. And it wasn't huge, it was like $1.50. But that was just entirely too much for a lot of poor people in general, but especially for poor African Americans and former slaves. The poll tax will prove incredibly effective. And you don't have to know the numbers, but just to give you an idea of how effective the poll taxes were, Louisiana will institute poll tax in 1893 and 1894. And between 1894 and 1904, so in that 10-year period, the number of African Americans that were voting went from 150,000 down to 1,500. So it was insanely effective. And that is just one example, but that would be true all throughout the South. Now, obviously, this has nothing to do with race. So at the same time, around 80,000 poor whites lost their ability to vote. And there will be attempts to try and just prohibit African Americans from voting, like grandfather clause, saying if your grandfather was able to vote, then you can vote. If your grandfather couldn't vote, then you're not allowed to vote. But those will be struck down by the courts because they were too blatantly obvious. So poll taxes will be some of the most effective. Now, you may be wondering, why exactly would poor whites accept this if it is hurting them? And it goes back to what I mentioned before. These are being passed at the same time other laws are being passed to put African Americans in a subservient position, to make them less equal to whites socially. And so for a lot of poor whites, they were willing to lose their right to vote as long as it meant that they were at a higher social level than African Americans. Obviously, there were lawsuits that challenged this, and there will be several of them. The one that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court that's most important for our purposes was Williams v. Mississippi. This was a case that got all the way up to the Supreme Court, in which, of course, African Americans were arguing that the laws disenfranchising them were unconstitutional based on the 15th Amendment. And what the court will rule in a unanimous decision, 9-0, is that as long as it didn't specify race, then these were allowed. Like literacy test, poll taxes, they are not unconstitutional because they don't specifically say African Americans cannot vote. So the Supreme Court, that's why this is state-sponsored segregation. The Supreme Court allowed the states to disenfranchise their population. And while this may sound like it is fair and effective, this essentially disenfranchised African Americans through a lot of the United States, especially through the South, until the Voting Rights Act in the 1950s. So that's how by 1898, African Americans were not completely, but essentially disfranchised. So African Americans will be disfranchised, and around the same time, they will also be segregated. Again, it is often assumed that this happened right after Reconstruction, and that's not accurate. Segregation laws will not be widespread until the 1890s, and 1880s, 1890s. And the big reason for it, and you need to know this for your paper, is the railroads. How exactly could the railroads be responsible for segregation? Well, a couple of reasons. First and foremost, a lot of places in the South, they didn't need to pass segregation laws because in most communities, African Americans understood what they were allowed and not allowed to do based on social customs. There were unwritten rules in local areas, in local towns, and former slaves knew what those rules are. Well, with the advent of railroads, all of a sudden you had people moving to different places. They would go to places where they didn't actually know the rules, and they would go up to a place where they didn't, the white population didn't know them, and so they would have to codify some of these because as railroads were connecting the country, it was separating the races. Because the second reason railroads are responsible for the beginning of segregation is it brought people into close proximity for the first, really close proximity. Not for the first time, but it brought them to closer proximity than they were used to. So, like, not obviously on the trains, but also in the train stations. All of a sudden, blacks and whites were sitting right next to each other, and a lot of whites didn't like this. The very first places that segregation laws were ever passed was in railroads. So railroads will be responsible for the beginning of segregation, and then from the railroads, it will spread out to the rest of society. Now, how on earth could this happen? We had that civil rights law in 1875 that said segregation was not allowed. As would be expected, when the southern states, it wasn't states yet, when the railroads would pass segregation laws governing their railroad stations and on the cars, there were a lot of African Americans that were unhappy, and they brought lawsuits. When they brought lawsuits, there were these will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the very first case to deal with this was the civil rights cases. It's called cases because it's five civil rights cases that were all brought together. African Americans ruled that they had the right to public places based on the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court will rule that the federal government has, or the 14th Amendment does not apply to private companies. And since railroads are private companies, then the 14th Amendment does not apply to private individuals, private organizations. So this will disfranchise this is essentially codifying segregation in private businesses, in private places. So because of this struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It just, they ruled it's unconstitutional, so now it's off the books. And this made it so it was legal to segregate in public places. And by public, that means non-government. Or, I'm sorry, private places. That means non-government institutions. So, civil rights cases said that now African Americans can be segregated only in private places. Obviously, this leaves schools and a lot of public places, so there were other challenges, and this led to the most important Jim Crow decision by the Supreme Court, and one of the most infamous decisions of the Supreme Court, Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, this started in Louisiana by a guy named Homer Plessy. He is 1/8 black, which means that he has, of his 8 grandparents, only one of them is African American. The other 7 are white. Now, under Louisiana law, he was not allowed to sit in the whites-only section of a train, and he purposefully broke the law. You can tell it's not even entirely clear he's black, but he went into the whites-only section, intentionally breaking the law, and he was arrested, and he sued, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson gave down one of their most infamous rulings. It was 7-1. One of the justices he couldn't be there. I think his daughter died. Doesn't matter. 7-1, Supreme Court will rule separate but equal. So all places, all public places, can be segregated as long as there are separate but equal facilities. Obviously, as time would show, separate was not equal, and it would not be equal. But this essentially segregated the entire South until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. So now we have laws in the books at the local, state, and federal level that allowed for disfranchisement and segregation of African Americans. While African Americans were being disfranchised and segregated, there was also a huge uptick in violence. When I say violence, we're talking about lynchings. In the 1880s and 1890s, there was a massive, massive uptick. And it is really important to understand lynchings and what lynchings are, and the significance of them. So during the period from roughly 1880 to roughly 1880 to 1970, throughout the United States, there were about 4,800 lynchings, roughly. Those are the ones we know of. Undoubtedly, the number's higher because there would be a lot we don't know of, but that is the amount that was counted, in the neighborhood of 4,800. So that is about a 70-year period, and divided up, that is roughly around 50 lynchings a year. Now, the vast majority of those were African Americans, African American men. But not all of them. More than 1,000 of them were whites, and somewhere around 200 were African American women. The whites that were lynched because they were stepping outside of the racial lines, like they were having relationships with blacks or they were promoting black rights. Now, that may not seem like a huge number, but you must understand how horrific they were. And in all of those cases, in less than 1% of the time, 1% of those cases was anyone actually brought to justice for the lynchings. So they overwhelmingly were not prosecuted because when there's a lynching, and we know a lot of the time who did the lynching because they didn't hide it. But even if it was brought to trial, it was tried by juries of peers in a southern state and southern county by a southern judge who would just rule that the person was not guilty. And the reason lynchings are so important to understand is because they occurred in public places. They usually were not hidden. They were done in front of big crowds, and they were intentionally really horrible because the point of them was to send a message of who was in control and what happens if anyone steps out of line. That is the purpose. That is why they were public, is to send a message to blacks, whites, everyone. What happens when you step out of the racial lines? There are so many examples, but I am just going to give you one. And again, it's just one example, but in this case, an anecdote demonstrates why lynchings were so powerful in intimidating blacks and whites and maintaining the racial order. And it's the lynching of a guy named Henry Smith. So this happened in Paris, Texas. It's in Lamar County. And this started because there was a 3-year-old girl named Myrtle Banks found beaten to death. Myrtle Banks' father was the sheriff in town, and he was notorious for beating inmates. One of the inmates that he had beaten very recently was a 27-year-old handyman in town named Henry Smith. Henry Smith was a notorious drunk, and he had been in jail, and he had been beaten by Myrtle Banks' father. And after he was let out, a few days later, that's when they found Myrtle Banks, the 3-year-old, beaten to death. So immediately, a lot of people said, well, it's Henry Smith. Now, there is no direct evidence of that. And there is no point in looking at all the lynching cases and saying, well, is he guilty or is he not guilty? Because as soon as attention turned to Henry Smith, a mob got together to go get him for a lynching. When Smith found out, he, of course, ran. And that is a key feature of these, is if you run to the lynching mob, that is evidence of guilt. And God help anyone that tries to stand in the way of the mob. So Henry Smith, he left Paris and he went back home to Hope, Arkansas, where his mom was. The mob then went to the local other African Americans in town and said, where does he live? And they told him he lives in Hope, or his family's from Hope. And so the lynch mob got on a train, went to Hope, Arkansas, got him, sent a message back to Paris and said, we have him, get ready. The mayor of Paris, Texas, made a proclamation closing down all schools and all businesses, and a big crowd of 10,000 people gathered and put up a scaffolding with the word justice on it. More than 10,000 people came out to watch. On the scaffolding is Myrtle Banks' father, the sheriff, her brother, and her 2 uncles. When they got back, everyone came out. When lynchings happened, they were very public spectacles. The police are there. Mayor is there. The schools are closed down. So kids are there with their family. There were like people selling food and souvenirs and stuff. It was like a fair. More than 10,000 people sat around and watched for hours as Henry Smith was tortured to death. And they took their time, because again, the point is to make it as horrible as possible. They took hot pokers that were like red hot and rubbed it up and down the arms and legs and back and burnt off the skin. And they then used those same pokers and poked out his eyes. When he screamed, they jammed it down his throat, and according to onlookers, their smoke or steam was coming out of his throat. And they used hot tongs and just pulled the muscle off of the bone. They castrated him with a hot iron, and they just tortured him for hours. And every time he would scream, the crowd would just erupt in cheers. This went on for hours and hours. And of course, within a little while, he just begged, please, kill me. But they dragged it on for for 3 or 4 hours, and the crowd just watched the whole time. 10,000 observers stayed there until finally, after several hours, and when he passed away from the pain, they set the scaffolding on fire, and even then the crowd stuck around until all the embers had burned out, and then the crowd rushed to get souvenirs. And this was very popular to do, is get souvenirs of the lynching, bones, teeth, whatever you could get. And the reason we have these pictures, the city of Paris sold these as postcards for decades to come. So this is widespread, like in the city. Everyone is involved in it. If you did not go to a lynching, then people would question why you didn't go. Did you not believe in justice? And it was a horrifying thing to observe. And it shows you why. On average, 50 lynchings a year all throughout the country. How many of these do you have to see in your life to understand you do not cross the racial barriers? Only one. That's why they were so intentionally horrible. And they were horrible. I mean, there's everything about it's horrible. You know, I've read people in the past, historians in the past saying, well, African Americans were involved, so obviously the person was guilty. But if you're an African American and you were asked, where's Henry Smith? You don't want to be on the wrong end of a lynching. And so African Americans, they would even attend these things, because if they didn't, it is like they didn't support it. And if you didn't support it, then you were against it. And so these were absolutely horrifying experiences for everyone involved. I feel bad for, obviously, Henry Smith. I feel bad for everyone involved. I feel bad for Myrtle Banks, Henry Smith, all the children that were at these. I've read firsthand accounts of people that attended lynchings, and they said they attended it as children, and they said the rest of their lives they never forgot that smell. And they said they would drink every night because it just, the sounds, the smells, everything about it haunted them. And this isn't even the worst. There were so many awful lynchings, and they all follow the same general category. Everyone was doing it in public. People came out in droves just to watch it, and it was supported by the local government. And there was no stopping. Once a lynch mob started, there was no stopping it. If you want to know the absolute worst cases, the Tulsa race riots in 1921 and the Sherman riot in Sherman, Texas in 1930. There's so many horrible ones, and you can't overestimate how awful lynching culture was. So how did African Americans respond to segregation, disfranchisement, and lynching? They didn't have a whole lot of options, but they did have some important leaders that came out and tried to speak for the black community. And one of the most famous of the era was Booker T. Washington. Washington was born a slave in the 1850s, and following freedom, he went to Hampton Institute and he got a vocational education. A vocational education is learning a skill or a trade. It's like an A&M education, and in agricultural and mechanics. You're learning a skill, you're learning a trade so you can earn money. And he did so well at Hampton Institute that when the people of Alabama wanted to create their own school for blacks, he was asked to lead it, and he will found Tuskegee Institute. At Tuskegee Institute, he was the one that he is the one that made Tuskegee into what it was. Under his leadership, it became a good school for African Americans, and it helped a lot of them. And it did such a good job that he will become the spokesperson for a lot of African Americans, especially in the South, by 1885. He insisted on only vocational education at Tuskegee. Only learn a skill. That means no history, no philosophy, no English, none of the liberal arts. And he will do a great job. And he does help a lot of African Americans. He especially got a lot of prominence because of a famous speech he gave called the Atlanta Compromise. In 1895, he gave a speech called the Atlanta Compromise. It was in Atlanta, Georgia, where he said, in effect, African Americans will not ask for the right to vote, will not challenge segregation, will not challenge racism in general. He said all African Americans want is education and a vocational education so they can advance themselves morally and economically. That way they can earn equality. So he was saying they would not fight for civil rights. African Americans would not fight for civil rights. They just wanted to build themselves up morally and economically, and then they would earn rights. Now, this obviously was insanely popular with whites, and what he is doing is the same thing that most rich, successful people do: is just say, well, why doesn't everyone just do exactly what I did? If everyone just does exactly what I do, then everyone can be like me. And there are two big problems with this. There's a lot of problems, but two big problems. First and foremost, this is the United States of America. No one should have to earn their right to be treated equal. Equality, being treated equal under the law, is supposed to be a bedrock of this country. Now, obviously, that's not true for a lot of periods of it, but no one should have to earn their right in a country that is founded on the Declaration of Independence. The second problem with this is, can all African Americans do this? Of course not. There's no way. Most whites could not do what Booker T. Washington did. He was an exceptional person. Again, that's what all rich and famous people do, is say, well, why doesn't everyone just do what I do? You hear this, like, it drives me nuts when you hear this with sports stars. Like, why doesn't everyone do what I do? It's like, basketball players that are like 7 foot tall. Why? I just worked harder. Well, you're also 7 feet tall and really athletic. Everyone cannot do what you do, and everyone couldn't do what Booker T. Washington did. It was, and not just because he was exceptional, but also because we know for sure that whites would not allow it. And this isn't my opinion on it. Whites made that very, very clear that they wouldn't allow it. This is a statement by one of the most popular senators gave this speech in 1901. Theodore Roosevelt actually had Booker T. Washington to the White House in 1901. And when he did, Southern senators went absolutely nuts. They went crazy. And Ben Tillman, is also called Pitchfork Tillman, he actually stood up on the floor of the Senate and said this: the action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that N-word will necessitate our killing 1,000 N-words in the South before they will learn their place. Again, you do not have to, this isn't my interpretation. This is one example of the just infinite amount of openly racist statements that were said. And obviously, you could say, well, Tillman doesn't represent the entire South, but the thing is, in a democratic system, your representatives, our senators, our governors, their morals represent the population. And what he was saying represented the morals of the population of South Carolina at the time. And there are just tons of examples of this. So Booker T. Washington, what he was saying was not realistic. Now, in his defense, a lot of people criticize him, and he does deserve criticism, but he helped thousands and thousands of African Americans. So he did make life better for thousands of African Americans. So he should not be completely discredited for what he said, because he did a lot of good. But he was, the white population, they absolutely loved him, because they could point to him and say, why don't all other African Americans do this? And they couldn't. It was very obvious that they couldn't do this. Most people couldn't, but especially African Americans, they could not do it, and the white population made that very, very clear. So Booker T. Washington, he will be a leader of, he will be considered the spokesperson for a lot of African Americans, especially in the South, until his death in 1915. If you've ever been to Tuskegee Institute, there's a statue of him. He is lifting the veil of ignorance off of the African race. That statue did not age very well. Booker T. Washington was not the only spokesperson for blacks. William Du Bois was also a popular spokesperson. And do not send me emails about I'm pronouncing that wrong. It's Du Bois. He pronounced it Du Bois, and so if he pronounced it Du Bois, it's Du Bois. Du Bois, he had the exact opposite background of Washington. He was born in a free community and a racially tolerant community in Massachusetts. So he did not experience a lot of racism, but he will go on to get a bachelor's degree in history, and then he got a PhD in sociology. He's the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He is also the founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And as head of the NAACP, he was an opponent of Washington's Atlanta Compromise. He criticized Washington and the Atlanta Compromise. He said Washington was speaking in half-truths. Yes, African Americans should advance themselves economically and morally, but they should also demand equal rights, because they should demand equal rights and citizenship because they were American and they deserved it. So he will target racism in general. He wasn't just for promoting the rights of African Americans. He also promoted the rights of all racially oppressed people, like Asians, too. So he will promote the cause of all racial minorities that were oppressed, and he will be a chief opponent and critic of Jim Crow and of lynching. Now, even he, though, said that African Americans should study English and should study history so they can become the spokespeople for African Americans. And he always talked about the talented 10th, that small 10% of the population that was going to lead the rest of them. So he did a lot for African Americans. Also, he will pass away one day before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, and 1 year before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So both of them, they were kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum, but what united them is they were both fairly elitist. They were both what they would consider the talented 10th. So what does that mean for the rest of the African American population? Can the rest of the African American population do what they did? No, of course not. They were unique. So most Americans, whether white or black, could not have done what they did. So what did the rest of the African American community do? How did they handle being segregated, being disfranchised, and racial violence? Community isolation. They formed themselves into very tight-knit communities. This is what virtually every group does throughout the world that are oppressed. They form tight communities where they obviously not only can have a little bit more protection, but they also have support. They wore a mask of deference, they avoided confrontation, and they just turned inwards. So African Americans will create their own communities, and in those communities, they create their own culture. If you want to know today why African American and white culture seem so at odds with each other, cannot point to any one thing, but this is a huge part of it. They will create their own culture within these communities that they had to form, their own way of speaking, and as we get to in the 1920s, their own music. So ultimately, though, they will just live as second-class citizens in the United States until the 1960s. And African Americans, they exhibit a very unique place in American culture for the sheer amount of laws that are specifically targeting them. It is one of the great problems. It is one of the most problematic parts of U.S. history, which is why it is so fundamentally important to understand, and it is the biggest blemish of the progressive era.